Our next speaker will be Nick Weber from Ecological Restoration.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, I'm really excited to talk to everybody today about the Bridge Creek Restoration Project, where we really sought to partner with beavers in stream restoration. And one thing before I get started I want to point out is we've seen some awesome talks already today about beaver-mediated or beaver-based restoration projects, and that's, you know, I come from a fish background. I think people are still maybe a little afraid to say beaver at our meetings, so it's really been pretty refreshing. And with that, let's just get started on this talk. So just to get you oriented here, Bridge Creek is a relatively small watershed. It flows north in Oregon's high desert, empties into the emptying into the John Day River. And our study area on Bridge Creek was basically the lower, about 30 kilometers of the Bridge Creek watershed below the town of Mitchell, Oregon. And the Bridge Creek project was initiated as an intensively monitored watershed. So these projects, there's about 17 of them were initiated throughout the Pacific Northwest. And these projects were designed to test, you know, does stream restoration really work? And in this case, does it work in terms of increasing the productivity of, you know, listed steelhead and salmon populations? And so these projects shared some things in common. They were all designed to have a large watershed scale restoration impact, be implemented according to an experimental design, and also be implemented with and incorporate a long-term monitoring plan. And so they're all designed to treat an impairment. So what was the impairment on Bridge Creek? Well, we've seen a lot of this today, but the impairment is one of channel incision. This is a photo that really typifies the kind of pre-restoration state of Bridge Creek. You can see it's highly simplified, straightened channel, really lacking any riparian vegetation, very, very straight and had no floodplain connectivity. So this picture was taken just before grazing management that really largely removed grazing from large portions of Bridge Creek. So let's skip ahead 20 years to the exact same spot. And what you can see, changing grazing, we have some amount of riparian vegetation development. It's maybe really stabilized the channel, but maybe it's stabilized it in a largely degraded state. It's still very straightened and really lacks any real floodplain development. And we've seen a lot of this today, talking about channel incision. So channel incision is a natural progression of streams, and so is recovery of channel incision. But what we talked about is this process from recovery, going from a simple to maybe a more complex channel that's reconnected to its floodplain, can take a really long time. And oftentimes these time scales, you know, they're not consistent with recovery planning, be it for salmon and steelhead populations or like sage grouse, like we've heard a lot about today. So that brings us to beaver ponds. So we've seen this before today too. You know, beaver ponds by their very nature, slow water velocities, trap sediment, and can really speed up that process of recovery from channel incision. The problem on Bridge Creek is that these kind of scenes were all too common. So these are all blown out and failed beaver dams, so in its highly incised state with high stream power, it really limited the ability for persistent beaver complexes, even though we had a population of beaver, to become established. And so that's really where the impetus for the restoration prescription on Bridge Creek came from, is that we needed a more flow-resistant beaver dam. So instead of rocks, which we've seen today, we used what we call the beaver dam analog, which consisted of pounding posts into the stream channel, and then weaving the posts, much like beavers, with vegetation that's available on site, putting cobble, gravels, and fill material that are readily available. So building these things very similar to how beavers build beaver dams. And so we installed the post using just a hydraulic post pounder powered by a hydraulic power pack. It's roughly the size of a wheelbarrow. This is just an example of our restoration kit. So the whole kit can be moved around quite easily. So it's a relatively easy restoration approach on the landscape and on existing riparian vegetation. And just an example of pounding posts with the post pounder. So this can be done by a relatively small crew. So this really makes this restoration approach highly scalable. You can, for relatively low cost, really extend this and install these structures over a large area. So on Bridge Creek, this is just an example of an overhead view of one of our restoration reaches. So in total, we treated four roughly 1 kilometer reaches on Bridge Creek. And this is just an example to show that we put these structures in at quite a high density and really designed them to kind of mimic an established beaver colony. And so that really comes down to the questions we wanted to answer on this project, which were, we wanted to test, can we use beaver dam analogs to really assist in speeding up this recovery from channel incision? And then in doing so, do we actually create benefits for fish populations? So I wanted to reiterate again that we implemented the restoration project according to experimental design. We had a number of treatment reaches, like I mentioned, and control reaches on Bridge Creek. We also monitored in an entire control watershed, and the design had a temporal component as well with pre-restoration monitoring, and the restoration largely going in 2009 with post-restoration monitoring as well. So I'm going to talk about a few results of the restoration project. First, I want to talk about the response of the beaver population itself. So we're really lucky to have a 30-year time series of beaver dam distributions on Bridge Creek. And what you can really see from this 30-year time series is that shortly after we implemented restoration, we saw a huge increase in the number of, this is just active beaver dams within our four treatment reaches. We saw a huge increase in the number of beavers that started to move in and take over these dams. So we found this to be a really positive result. So what this basically suggests is that by installing beaver dam analogs, you can encourage beavers to move to specific stream reaches that might need an intervention and kind of set up shop and establish persistent colonies. And the impact of beavers establishing persistent colonies were extremely dramatic on Bridge Creek. So we can see this, I think these aerial photos really typify the response. So we see a largely single thread, rather narrow riparian corridor, and in a short period of time, the channel turning into a highly complex multi-threaded channel with an increased riparian area and storing huge volumes of water. So one question I often get asked when I show aerial photos like this showing increases in surface water is, doesn't this heat up streams in these high desert streams to the detriment of fish? And temperature is a really important factor limiting steelhead in Bridge Creek. This is just a typical year of the temperature regime. And you can see that for a good portion of each summer, temperatures are at or above what you might consider the critical maximum for the rearing juvenile steelhead. Luckily on Bridge Creek, in many cases, we had collected temperature information just downstream of our restoration reaches. So we were able to actually quantify how establishment of beaver complexes affects stream temperature. And instead of increasing temperature, what we usually found is that increasing water storage serves to moderate high summer temperatures. I think this graph can really typify that moderation. So this just shows daily temperature regime in midsummer, before and after restoration. And so what we have is a treatment reach in red. You can see that following restoration, we see the daily temperature regime become highly compressed. And in many cases, that compression actually reduces daily maximum summer temperatures, and oftentimes it reduces it just below the critical maximum for juvenile steelhead. And not only did we see it actually just compress and reduce high daily temperatures, we also saw that in beaver complexes, we often get increased connection to the groundwater, which creates cool water refugia. So to look at this, we actually measured temperature at a high density of locations in a beaver complex and also in unimpounded kind of plain bed sections of channel. And what we saw is this large signature for temperature refugia in beaver complexes, in some cases where temperature was moderated by up to 10 degrees, while temperatures within the unimpounded plain bed reaches only differed by about a degree and were still largely above the temperature thresholds for steelhead. Okay, so well, hopefully I've convinced you that we've increased habitat complexity and increased the temperature complexity available for our target fish population. So how did they actually respond? Did we actually increase populations of steelhead? Well, we implemented a very extensive monitoring of steelhead populations. We tagged greater than 80,000 steelhead over the duration of the project with pit tags. This allows us to track their growth rates, their abundances, and survival, both before and after restoration. And you can see that the response of these fish, this is just juvenile steelhead abundance within our treatment in Bridge Creek and also our control watershed and murderers. There's a lot of annual and interannual variation, both before and after restoration, but being that we had this Bakke study design, we were able to boil all that data down into just a few box plots. And from there, it's pretty apparent to see that, before restoration, steelhead abundances were much lower in our treatment watershed than our control watershed. While following restoration, we saw that steelhead populations got increased dramatically above our control watershed. We saw a really similar response for steelhead survival, where before restoration we had much lower survival of steelhead within our treatment watershed, and then it was roughly equivalent to our control watershed following restoration. So it appeared that the establishment of persistent beaver complexes was able to benefit juvenile steelhead. Well, one question I often get asked is, doesn't the establishment of beaver dams impede the movement of spawning steelhead? And we have a really great infrastructure for looking at fish movement within our watershed. So this map just shows the lower 30 kilometers of Bridge Creek. And it also shows it's flowing north into the John Day. And it also shows the location of in-stream antennas that we can use to actually track the movement of adult steelhead through our entire study area. And what you might expect is that as the number of dams on Bridge Creek increases, that we'd actually see their spawning distribution become truncated and reduced. So let's go to 2009, where on Bridge Creek we only had 22 beaver dams and a couple small complexes, and our beaver dam analog structures weren't in yet. And this year, of the steelhead that entered Bridge Creek, we saw about 17% of them swim all the way through the study area. So let's go to 2016. We now have 164 beaver dams. We also have all of our beaver dam analog structures in. And this year we saw, of the steelhead that entered Bridge Creek, about 30 of them swam all the way through our entire study area. So this was pretty compelling evidence for us that we're not actually impeding the movement of steelhead, but it's serving a benefit to the population. Okay, well that was just a brief overview of some of the things that we've learned on the Bridge Creek project. There's quite a bit more. I encourage you. We have quite a few publications. There's a lot more about the restoration methods that we implemented in a beaver restoration guidebook. So just to kind of finish up, I want to give an example of how a place where we more recently have exported what we've learned on Bridge Creek to novel watersheds. And so I just want to share a little bit about the Bear Creek Restoration Project. This is another stream in Oregon's high desert. And this is really the habitat on Bear Creek. This is really typical summer flows, is that it becomes largely intermittent each summer. And so obviously offering really poor habitat conditions for the listed steelhead populations that rear there. So this is just a quick photo of last summer. Arriving right as the stream was going dry, arriving at our restoration site on Bear Creek, and beginning to install beaver dam analogs, at which point we are actually rescuing steelhead parr from riffles that are going dry and transporting them to pool habitat where they still have flow. And I thought this just gave a really great example of the immediate benefits that you can give to a stream using these restoration approaches, where we immediately started to store large amounts of surface flow within just a couple days' time in a relatively low investment of restoration effort. And not only did we greatly increase the amount of surface water, but there was also evidence that we immediately started to store large amounts of groundwater as well. This was evident in areas on the floodplain, sometimes 20, 30 meters off the channel, that immediately just began to fill with water as we began to pond up the restoration reach. And this benefit of storing more water also seemed to immediately benefit the steelhead population. So again, on Bear Creek, we're also monitoring steelhead, both in treatment and control reaches. So this is just an example of the density or number of steelhead in our treatment and control reach at the beginning and at the end of summer. What was pretty apparent is that in our control reach, which was just allowed to go virtually dry and become intermittent, we saw that the density of juvenile steelhead decreased by about half. So these fish may have moved, but it likely is evidence that by starting to store surface water, we can increase the survival of juvenile steelhead. And not only do we potentially increase survival, but we also saw evidence that we had that steelhead within our control treatment reaches had higher growth rates, where we saw the growth rates as the percent change in body weight in our control reaches decreased over the course of the summer. And within our treatment reach, where we started to store more surface water, almost all fish achieved positive growth rates. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks a lot, and I hope I gave you some great examples of beaver-based restoration approaches that you might use for your stream and riparian restoration projects. And I bet I have time for questions.
Downstream users thinking you're grabbing their water and working all that out from a partnership perspective.
The question was, how do you deal with storing water in terms of downstream water use and from a regulatory perspective? For this project, we didn't have to run into that. We didn't have downstream water use, and so we didn't have to run into that. But I know that's becoming, it's somewhat of a gray area. I don't know at this time in Oregon water law if there is a really great response. Yeah. The question was, do you have to do a lot of maintenance, and do you have to do a lot of restoring these beaver dams, and do they suffer failures? In some cases, you do see, say, a little bit of post loss or maybe a little bit of head cutting or end cutting around a structure. In a lot of cases, that just adds a lot of maybe needed habitat complexity and formation of a scour pool, maybe deposition of a bar. So you can and you can go in and do maintenance. We did about 3 years of maintenance from the initial 2009. We put in about 100 structures and then followed up with structure additions and some structure repairs where we needed to. In an ideal scenario, you have a population of beaver that will come over and kind of take over maintenance for you, and that's eventually what happened on Bridge Creek. There is pre-LiDAR data. We also have, I didn't show any of that here. We have extensive topographic surveys where we've done change detection as well.
One more question.
I think that's a great question. The question is there a danger as the population of beavers seem to increase, will they actually be limited by the amount of food available and eat themselves out of house and home? This is a highly productive area where it seems like willows just seem to outgrow any number of beavers that become established. I could see maybe that's a problem at higher elevations, areas with a shorter growing season. I'm not totally sure, but on this system, it seems like there's endless amount of willow.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.